You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for premium wine and spirits at vintmarketplace.com. As always, I'm joined in studio by Billy Galanko. How you doing, Billy?
Great. We're all refreshed from our offsite last week. Actually, it was pretty busy, but back and ready to go.
Yeah, it was great to hang out. Recorded a little bit in person, the intro for last week. That was cool. I feel like we get to do that every year, or every time we go out on an offsite, we get to do a little in-person recording, which is fun. And always good to catch up and drink wine together also.
Yeah, it was a great week. You definitely had a bunch of great wines that we had imported from around the world. So that was really exciting. And now we're ready to kick off a bunch of new initiatives for 2025, which is today what we're actually going to talk about. This is our annual kind of look at the year ahead in wine. Last year we did trends in 2024. I think everybody and their uncle has already done a 2025 trends, but I think it's time for us to kind of take a pass at looking at everything. We kind of did a review of all these articles, and we've picked one of our favorites to talk about today.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has a lot to say on every topic in the entire world when the new year starts, especially when there's a new political administration and all of these things. Like, yeah, tons of opinions out there on the internet. And so we found some of the better wine opinions we could. Actually, our friends over at the New Wine Review put together a really good sort of 5 things to watch in 2025. And they should be a good lead in for some of our talking points and things that you and I actually, before we even started digging into these articles, had talked to each other about. So excited to share it with everyone.
Yeah. So the point of this episode is always to we use maybe an article or two as a guide, but it's to give you kind of our perspective on what's driving wine in the world, I guess, kind of going into the new year. And it's interesting always because Brady is very much, I know we both work for the same company, but Brady is very much a collector and has his own certain views on wine and how he consumes. And I'm very much, out here on the West Coast, going to some of these natural wine bars, reading wine history books, very much more on my lane. So it's always interesting to see where our projections and interests collide and where they move away. And then our perspectives on the world of wine in general can vary widely. So this is always an exciting time for me to see what you think.
Yeah, Billy's the academic. I'll provide the hot takes, and Billy will provide the nuance. So that's how we'll jump into this. This is actually, this is a good one. The comment in the New Wine Review for sort of their first, not trend, but, I guess it's a trend that they expect to continue, which is white wine will continue to become more popular than red wine, which, fine by me. I think probably fine by most wine enthusiasts, collectors, producers that you talk to. Almost all of them are drinking more white wine than red wine. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I think this is something that is kind of maybe a misconception among less wine educated people or less wine experienced. I won't even say educated, is that like wine is red. You should mainly be drinking red wine, and that's what you should do. When I started studying, so I basically, up until my mid-20s, when I rarely had wine that much, I would have red wine. And then when I started studying seriously, within 3 or 4 months, basically, I became a white wine guy. If I had to pick, just something while I was out, and have remained that way, that and orange wine now the rest of my life. And I think it's not that I don't like red wines, and there's certainly a time and place and a way to appreciate all of them. But I think there's just something to be said about, if you just want to have a quick bottle, if it's hot outside, something to pair with a meal, something that's really bright and refreshing that you might have a glass or two of. It's kind of the same way that a cocktail kind of refreshes the palate, and it's something that makes you kind of salivate and want another one. Whereas like maybe a glass of red wine could be a whiskey that you want to kind of sip and savor, but you're not necessarily, doing it for a refreshing pairing or something.
Yeah, I guess I mixed. I said that you were going to be the one to provide the nuance, but I sort of have mixed feelings about the white wine, red wine thing, because I definitely have this bias that, for instance, red wines should be more expensive. And so even if I'm buying a very, very high quality, like top producer white wine, I feel like I should be getting a discount to their red labels. And maybe certainly you should. There are different processes. It can be more expensive. to produce red wine and oak aging and things like that. I totally get that. But I definitely have this bias where if you told me, okay, you're going to purchase the best white wine in the world and the best red, I'll be like, oh, well, the red will probably cost 3 times as much. And I would never pay 3 times as much for the white. And as a buyer collector and someone who probably buys as much as buys a bottle as frequently as I drink a bottle, I want to sort of get out of that gut reaction of not paying for quality, ageable, complex white wine, which can be enjoyed the same way you describe red wine, sort of sitting and drinking it slowly to explore its layers and nuances. Certainly the best wines in the world you can do that with.
Agreed. And I mean, yeah, I didn't mean to note that there weren't these deep, complex, crazy white wines. And those age ones are some of my favorites. But I think you touched on a really interesting part. We could unpack that a little bit, is that most white wines, I would say a larger majority, aren't meant to be aged. Or if they do, they only age, 5 to 10 years. So I think that's part of what people are looking at when they look at the collectability of something. They're really looking at that longer term thing. There are those handful that can age 10, 20, 30 more years than that and develop beautifully. But I think that's part of the perception of quality needs to be aged. And that's why everybody put, like red Bordeaux is, top of the mountain on that side, or even the top Pinot Noirs that can age that long. I think that's where that conception comes from. And like you said, there's plenty of things that go into production that can make a red wine cost more. I mean, whether it be the extended oak aging, even the fact that they harvest most of those grapes later than they do the white wines. So there's, a higher chance of rain or disease or some issue causing some issue with harvest. There's, innumerable things that go into the production,
Sure.
but
Yeah. And I get the premium for ageability. That's a great point. Of course, there are also a whole swath of white wines that I think that people don't even think about for their collections. You think about Rieslings on the sweeter side from, all over Germany, all over Austria, Sauternes, wines that can outlive almost every red wine, right? That is out there. So yeah, it's a really cool space. I think bottom line, if you aren't exploring white wines, or if you haven't been exploring white wines as much the last couple of years, maybe make that a priority in 2025 and see what the world of white wine has to offer.
100%. Second all of that. Now let's move on to the next topic that in this article in particular talks about Neo-Prohibitionism and the wine industry need to push back on, no alcohol. I think we can broaden this topic to talk about a little bit more about some of these reports that have been coming out regarding alcohol as, causing cancer and also being an enormous health risk. And then along with the trend of, younger generations and even myself, for example, I drink some more no and low alcohol things than I may have used to in the past. Let's just talk about both of these. Where do you want to start there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the health stuff is super important. The health organizations have been extremely clear recently, without any real nuance at all, that alcohol is detrimental to your health in any quantity. And I'm not really sure, actually, that I disagree with that, which we can talk about. But I think that the health stuff is a good place to start.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of torn. As somebody who wasn't born and raised in California and moved out here, you will think that everything causes cancer. Like there's signs on literally everything. You'll be in the parking garage and it's just telling you how about the fumes from cars can cause cancer, and everything really can. In moderation, anything that causes your cells to change, causes inflammation in your body, will cause something to happen down the line. For example, my wife was raised not being told, like, if there's any charred bits on your barbecue, for example, you should take those off because those are carcinogens and they'll cause cancer, which is actually true. I looked more into it, but a lot of people will char a little bit of their broccoli, there are a lot of these things that we do. And I think in moderation, won't necessarily be the end of the world. But I do think, I guess maybe some people were pounding a bunch of booze unaware of this, but I think it was just something that's kind of already understood in a macro sense.
Yeah, and I know people get tired of the anything can give you cancer, ice cream, chips, whatever. But it's also kind of true. Too much of anything is, can be detrimental, obviously. And so, it's common to talk about the French paradox, how they eat a high-fat diet, drink a lot of wine, a lot of alcohol generally, but they're also, low instances of heart disease. And same thing, I think, in maybe like Japan and some or some of the Asian countries. There are a ton of other factors. It's not just alcohol intake. And so Yeah, I think that folks who want to see the forest for the trees can see through some of that stuff and be like, okay, yeah, obviously, maybe not great to be guzzling a bottle a night. But I mean, we have so many instances of people living healthy, productive lives and being able to enjoy wine in a, measured way.
Yeah. I mean, I had referenced, I'd finally finished it. So that's why people have heard me talk less about Hugh Johnson's Story of Wine. But there wouldn't, I mean, it's no longer used as a medicine per se, like it had been for thousands of years, but there wouldn't be a beverage. If it made people keel over, or I think people would have maybe stopped drinking as much of it over the past 3,000 plus years. I mean, I know it's been consumed before that, but in recorded history. So I have a feeling that, I think there is a middle ground. So we'll work through that and get there. But the other part is
one more thing is we're just coming out of, I think, a boom of college, right? From the maybe late 70s to now, or till COVID, maybe, right? The largest amount of people we've had in history have gone off into and experienced college away. And here in the US, that can certainly be a gateway to pretty heavy drinking into your 20s and even into, your early 30s. So I think there's also just a sizable enough population that has been drinking pretty hardcore for 15 years, and the younger part of our generation. Not saying that the older folks don't drink a lot too, but I think that in the sort of contemporary discourse, that's just a phase of life that, our younger generations are in. Call it millennial and whatever the one younger than millennial is.
Gen Z. Yeah. That's an interesting thing. I never really thought about that. But I will say, so now onto the neo-prohibitionist no and low thing. Like you said earlier, I think moderation is interesting for everything. And then there's another aspect that we're going to talk about a little bit further down about mystifying wine again in that term. But I think at least something I've found myself doing, especially when I want to try either multiple wines or, really enjoy a wine, but also just, have another beverage. Like I have multiple beverages at my dinner table now. Like we just went to a tasting where I tasted, some 2-ounce pours. That was cool. I think small pours. And then also it's like, if you have a wine and a non-alcoholic beer next to it, you can kind of just continually sip on that beer and then actually smell and enjoy the wine and not treat it as something that you need to pound in order to get drunk. I think it's something that is a different use case than a beer that people mindlessly kind of put down as something that's a pick up, put down type thing.
Yeah, and I think the niche in the market for someone who's enough of an enthusiast that like, I really just want to have the taste of beer, but also like doesn't want any alcohol. I don't know. Probably sounds good on posters and in marketing campaigns. I'm just not really sure how big that market is or really ever will be, because that feels like an interesting intersection, right?
Yeah. So I'm on the same thing with wine too. And I think we'll talk about that in the next topic here. But like, I think anybody who's like, I just love wine so much, but I don't want the alcohol. The only people that do that must have some like medical issue, because otherwise, if you loved wine enough, you wouldn't be wanting one without any alcohol. You would know enough to maybe find a low ABV one or try something else, like a naturally low ABV, not like, I mean, I can talk a little bit about it, but if you, in the winery, like people are seeing these extracted wines, like alcohol removed, and there's a process called reverse osmosis. There's a few other things you can do, but basically it heavily manipulates the wine. It pushes it back through filters, which, I mean, some of these commercial grade wines are done, filtered with reverse osmosis and some other things anyway. But like the way the wine is just manipulated and jammed through some of these things in order to remove the alcohol. I mean, you're literally separating out the alcohol molecules and water molecules and then having it reconvene. You're not getting the same thing as a wine. Like, sure, it might taste wine-esque and be from grapes, but anybody who thinks like, oh, they'll just lightly remove the alcohol and it'll be just fine. I mean, as of now, it's an integral part of how a wine expresses itself. It's an integral part of structure. So I hope they're able to. But I think it'll always be kind of an other. I don't think it's going to happen very often where you mistake one for a full alcohol wine when it's not.
Well, speaking of mistaking one type of wine for another, do you think you could spot a cheap bulk wine among fine wines? Well, hopefully you can, master of wine to be. The third point is cheap bulk wine will continue its decline. Is that a good thing?
Yes. And I I completely agree. This is even coming from someone who worked a little while at a bulk winery. If you want to, we're going to have a YouTube video soon with some photos from the winery and you can see what it looks like when you're working there. But this is why I didn't really like wine until, my late 20s. This is all I was exposed to for the most part, especially on the white wine category and sparkling. It's a lot of these just bulk wines. And that's what I thought wine was. And I think a lot of people, when they're exposed to this, it is what wine is to them. Maybe it's served in a giant glass and they're just trying to have a few glasses to get a buzz when, they could probably be spending maybe only a fraction of that more and get a quality wine, maybe from, Spain or Chile or one of these producing regions that is maybe a little bit more thoughtfully crafted. But I'm pretty excited that this is a thing because I've been wondering if this is happening, but I just haven't had my finger on the pulse as much. And then to your question about the bulk wines, I was actually just listening to the kind of, how do you frame this properly? I guess basically a review from the Master of Wine exam last year. It was like a debrief on the questions, and it was the chairman of the practical exam, which is a tasting, talking about the wines and people's responses to them. And one of them was a Yellowtail Shiraz. So that was pretty interesting. The Yellowtail has been on the exam, I think they said 3 times in the last 20 years. So it is something I could be tested on. They said most of the people identified it as a large, like high volume bulk style of wine. People had a little bit of trouble narrowing it down where it was from, rightfully so, because the whole point is to make kind of just a pleasing style, not a wine of place. But I think we could be able to identify some.
Yeah, when I was in college, my wine of choice would be the Yellowtail Pinot Grigio. And they had it at the liquor store near where I went to school for like $6.99 or like buy 3 for $5.99 each. It was like crazy cheap. And so that would be my thing because I didn't drink beer. And so that was really my intro into wine. I actually really liked it. And that's interesting. You said like, especially the white wines, but I think that's indicative of like, I was drinking a wine that can be really great value at a lower price point anyways. Right. And so it's not like abnormal that they could actually make a decent Pinot Grigio at, $10 or $6 or $7. I don't know. And certainly, probably had a whole lot of craziness going on with it. I'm just demonstrating that you can find really cool things at that price point, but not a good place to take step 2. Because if you spend too much time in the bulk and commercial space, I think you get to where you're talking about is you start to think everything tastes that way.
Yeah.
Not
and that's
complexity.
Agreed. And that's what they're kind of getting at in this article, which I agree with, is a lot of folks have been treating this bulk wine that's, kind of all tastes the same as a starter wine, as like where people start. And that's going to really get them hooked to move on in wine. And exactly to your point, if you're spending the lowest amount and then you spend maybe $5 more, like say you're starting at like $5 or even like $2 chuck, and then you spend $5 more because you think it's going to be noticeably better and then you're going to constantly improve, you're not really going to see that much of a difference. And even if you're buying like a cheap California one that has like fancy branding that's like $15, the difference in flavor from, a $5 wine to a $15 wine to most people will not be noticeable, of like, say it's like a Central Valley California wine. So I think it is more of a deterrent because you go up a certain number of tiers and you think what all the wine will generally taste like.
I mean, if you have if your first white wine is like a $7 Chardonnay that says California on the front, and then you're just like, oh, I like that, and you start trying to drink more California Chardonnay, I mean, you could get to like $30, $35, and not find something like noticeably like that wows you back in that category. You really could, like, especially if someone's buying from like the supermarket or not walking into a wine shop, it's very possible that they could stay in that style and that price point and think that they have to exceed that because they haven't either drank other regions or tried different white wine grapes.
Yeah. And then the same thing with red wine. I remember it's one wine that I tried to have. I think in my life, I told you before, I mainly drink red wines. And it was like, it would be once every so often, maybe 3 times a year. I was living in Richmond and I wanted to like splurge. I think I was 24, maybe 23. And for my birthday, I wanted to buy a fancy bottle of wine. So I bought a $50 Brunello di Montalcino. It's the most I'd ever spent on any bottle of wine. I went up to this like park at sunset. I was drinking it. I was by myself. I guess that's kind of sad, but I had it, and it was a new release Brunello di Montalcino. So I mean, it was only a few years old. It was incredibly tannic. It was not tasty. It was not ready to drink by itself. It needed food at least. So I could see somebody like me back then. I was like, I could have had this cheap wine that had soft tannins. It was really juicy, kind of refreshing because it was probably acidified. And then I had this wine that I was like, I don't really see why people pay $50 for this, because it wasn't ready to drink yet. So I think that's even a harder leap than some of the white wines to kind of rationalize or to understand what you're paying more for.
That's funny that you had that experience. I think we had almost the same exact moment at the same age of being like, oh, I want to go try something really good. I remember I bought a $35 bottle of Linden in Richmond, Virginia. So Linden Vineyards in Virginia. And it was their claret. And yeah, it was like $35. I was like, man, like this better be good. And then the second experience I remember was a $75 bottle, also a Virginia wine that I remember. It was the first year we got married. I think we weren't even married a year yet. And I said to her, I was like, we were at the winery. It was a Williamsburg winery. And I wanted to get this bottle. And I was like, should I do it? $70? She's like, yeah, like, you know, it was my birthday or something. She's like, yeah, like, you know, whatever you want. I was like, oh man, like $70, which I know is, you know, yeah, that's a lot of money, but just funny that we had the same experience.
Yeah, but different outcomes. You got onto wine a lot earlier than I did. That one, it took me 4 more years than watching Somm a few times to be like, what is this whole wine thing all about? Before I hopped on.
That's
yeah, deep. All right, cool. So let's move on from there. I think this is a good segue. We can kind of touched on it already, but the $31.99 wine is the new $12.99 wine. And I think what they're getting at here is you used to be able to find these examples of unique wines of place, you know, whether it be like a cheap Albarino, or maybe not Albarino, that's still under $20, but maybe some of these entry level from well-known regions that were around, you know, $12.99 maybe 20 years ago are now, you know, $30 to $35.
Yeah, I mean, let's do Oregon Chardonnay. I don't know what people were paying 15 years ago for that, but I'm sure half as much as what we're paying now. So I know it's not like, you know, a premier region or whatever. I'm just trying to find examples of where this has been the case. And yeah, I think I would just echo the comments I made about the way that you could try a California Chardonnay and not really get anything different until over $30. I think that is also encompassed in this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think it really depends on the region. I think there's still a lot of great value you can find lower. There's certainly a lot higher. So I think saying $31.99 is a mid-range for so-called entry levels for some of the top regions. I definitely saw a lot of like some Italian wines, for example, like some of the kind of culty producers, but some of the sought-after producers from, say, you know, Chianti Classico, like Fontodi, and maybe there's a like Barbacan, which is a small producer in the north, just east of Piemonte. They're going for, you know, like $30 a bottle for some interesting stuff. So, I mean, you can definitely find stuff below that. I think that for somebody trying to get more serious wines of place, I think that's an interesting starting point.
Yeah, depends on where you're buying too. I mean, there are a ton of great French wines that you can buy for under $30 in France, and certainly not and $30 is definitely not entry level there or in any other European country. So
yeah, well, and I think what they're also getting at is not just the quality; it's the popularity. So when they're saying like everybody was going for those really cheap wines before, I think now it's fewer, and they're saying, you know, according to this one wine industry report, basically that's the most quickly growing category in wine, when a lot of other categories of wine are actually slowing down or if not going negative. And I think that again shows people are trying to find more interesting wines, maybe drink fewer of them and really enjoy them. So I think that's interesting. And then I think we can transition here finally to what I think is, I keep saying interesting, the most fascinating topic is the idea that demystifying or simplifying wine or making it fun will be overdone or will be kind of the end of that era. What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree that you can probably graph level of shallowness in wine education against, you know, someone's length of stay in the wine world, right? Like, just like any hobby, there's sort of the basic level knowledge or like threshold for knowledge that to just participate, but then there's like another layer of knowledge to sort of go deep and make it part of your lifestyle and to be a hobby. I mean, that exists in any hobby. The threshold for if you're not trying to make wine like a hobby or a real interest of yours is basically knowing the difference between red and white and like acid, maybe. I'm not sure you need to know anything else if you don't want to make wine like an interesting part of your day to day. But then beyond that, it's just a cliff that you fall off in terms of knowledge, and beyond it, there's no real way to determine what's more important, what's less important in terms of what knowledge someone consumes. So you're either in or you're out, I think, on wine knowledge, and most people, I think, are better served just knowing that here's the delineation. Like, do you want to make this a hobby or not? Is that too hot of a take?
No. I mean, I wasn't even thinking about it from the hobby side. I think it's interesting that you went there. I think for me, what drew me in initially to wine, like I said, I wasn't even drinking wine that much, was from the art history side. It had all of the cool nuances and the things that you could learn and fun facts that you could tell people. And it was like a never ending hole of interesting topics that really drew me in. And I think if you're simplifying it too much, and that's gotten on my nerves because everybody wants to start a new channel, an Instagram handle or whatever. It's just like, the reason people aren't drinking wine is it's too complicated. And I think like for a while in the 90s, early 2000s, it might have gotten too pretentious. You had these people saying, you want to understand it, you want to appreciate it. But it wasn't because wine was, I mean, the way they were like conveying it to people might have been too complicated for sure. But like, it wasn't the unique stories or the like special soil made things some way. I think about other hobbies, I guess, to your point, or people who are into categories like watches or cars. They're into these not because of, they just really like telling time or they like driving fast. They're into them because they want to know like the nuance of the watch movement, or, how something works, or the special nature of the car and the aerodynamics that like help it go faster. Like, they're asking about that. They're not asking it, can you please simplify this car? Like, is it like big engine, small engine? All right, cool.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's another category where people do this I mean, I'm sure there is somewhere, but of the broad market of sort of like enthusiast and collector and hobbyist genres, there's just not many where people like make the leap from depth and nuance to like, oh, this is just like too complex. They don't even do it, in my experience, in the whiskey world. I've never heard anyone say like, oh, whiskey, I've heard them say like there's a lot out there and there's a lot to explore. It's all very optimistic, right? But with wine, there's a lot to explore. It's too complicated. Don't know where that came from. I think it's just holdover from what, like you said, some of the pretension attached to it. I think that people sometimes have like a gut reaction to, well, if I know too much about this or start saying, well, Gevrey Chambertin, people are going to look at me funny. And so, yeah, you just have to decide, like, are you going to be the wine guy in your friend group? Or are you going to just say red, white, does it go with fish? Does it not?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily simplifying. It's just like sharing the right information. I think maybe for years, everybody talked about these tasting notes. And if you don't get this tasting note, then you can't understand wine. Like these certain flavors. Like, that's so dumb. Like, I see a lot of friends now, and we've mentioned it in the realm of the natural wine movement, but we're at a table. They bring like this bottle that has some strange label. Maybe it's completely in like Georgian writing. And then they tell us a story about how it was fermented in an amphora underground in this small village by like this family who's been doing this for 200 years. And they love that story. And it's like, that's the story that's behind a lot of the other best wines in the world. So if Assam, if anybody came to your table and told you this cool story, you would really get into it and be like, cool, I think I can taste like this earth, rather than somebody being like, this is a Premier Cru Burgundy. Don't worry, you don't need to learn the classification system because it's above your head. It's really good. And here are the exact tasting notes you're going to get. And if you don't taste that, then you're wrong. Like, I think it's just been the wrong story. It's not that people need it simplified or demystified. I think it's just like the way that it's been going about it is completely wrong. And I think the guard has really changed overall in how we're sharing wine with the world. And I think if people talked about it that way, it would be much more, fun to have around on tables, even for younger folks.
Yeah. And it's tough to know if you're like getting duped or not. Like if if a Somm comes to the table and starts talking about the terroir and these kinds of things, it's hard to know, like, is this really a wine I want? How am I going to know if I like it? Is it worth the money? All of these kinds of things. If you don't understand what they're saying, jump in or, creep in. But if they come to the table and they tell you a story, like, everyone can resonate with a good story, right? And can find value there in experiencing something that's connected to that story. So, I agree with you.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you just said is really important, is the connections. So, like, this is the same way I found with art and wine. It's like, if you like, like they say, if you like this one, you can like go to this other one, or like this wine was inspired by that. You can go down this rabbit hole of like, oh, it's in this place, which grows X because of Y. This guy moved there a few years ago, but he's influenced by this person. And like, there's a fun network that you can go down to find more things that you might like. And then you get to tell your friends. Everybody loves like something that they found, and they can show their friends, regardless of what category it is. Even if it's like your new iPhone, it's like, cool, this new thing I found. So I think that'll be eventually the solution to like connect. Everybody says, how do they connect with Gen Z? And I was just thinking about this the other day. It's like really expensive wines. Like, what if there was just a huge gap of like, what's going to have these people, the younger people, transition into these older collectors that we work with now? And I don't see it slowing. I see a lot of my friends randomly getting into it, as someone in their mid 30s. It's just like an interesting transition. And I think, I don't think there's ever been a generation where just people in their late 20s were collecting really expensive wine. I just don't think that was a thing. Maybe they were drinking more back in the day. But
yeah, I mean, we've heard that I'm supposed to like be at a place where I can afford these things and talk about these things. I feel behind, and maybe that could actually turn them off from the category.
Yeah, I mean, they might be late, but also there's always that pushback against, you don't want to do what your parents' generation did, I guess, as well. And I think that might go back to the bulk wines. Is like, there's that stereotype of like a soccer mom with like a cheap Chardonnay, or like, I think a lot of us can remember growing up, and there was always like, these people just getting wasted off these bottles of wine that were like, cheap, and they were just poor, and they'd let you have a taste, and it tasted awful. Like, I think that's also something that people are getting over still. And I think that's a discovery period that takes a while. It's not like, especially if you're not drinking as often, you got to try a bottle here, try a bottle there, a glass at a restaurant, and then you slowly, crescendo into things that you like more.
100%. I think actually this last one speaks to all of the other topics that we had. Like, ultimately telling people stories is going to get them to a place where they're willing to spend $10 to $20, now to $30 on wine. Telling them the stories will move them out of the cheap and bulk wine category. And yeah, white wine, red wine, there's great stories to be told for both.
All right. Well, going into the year for 2025, let's wrap up with, what are you most excited about or just into drinking wise right now for the year?
What am I into drinking this year? Yeah, I think I mentioned about having sort of that slight bias towards, in terms of wines that I'm buying to drink later, towards red wines, trying to shift that a little bit to white. I don't often walk into a wine store and buy something that I'm going to drink that night, or my wine shop. I usually have the wines that I drink for at least a couple months before I drink them. And so what I have in my cellar right now, a few white Burgundy and some Bordeaux, and then been drinking a decent amount of German wines and Chilean wines. I know, like, different parts of the world, but Chilean wines and German wines. So a lot of Riesling over the holidays this past year, and definitely want to drink more in 2025.
Cool. I was just listening again to these MW, basically exam administrators, talk about the wines, and they had a Syrah from Chile a couple years ago in the exam, and they were asking if anybody on the exam actually called it a Chilean Syrah, and I don't think many people got it. So luckily, the MW program gives you points for breaking down the wine, not necessarily just getting the location like the MS. For me, 2025 will be a big red wine year, just because I will be taking that MW exam, and for the exact reasons that I had mentioned earlier. I don't drink a lot of red wines just for fun. If we're out at one of our local wine bars, maybe we'll have a glass of red, but we tend to lean more sparkling white, orange, even rosé too, just because I love that acid. But I need to start understanding the nuance. Because to me, when you're blind tasting white wines, to me just like pop off the page, or my Rolodex of white wines is just really deep. Red wines, there's to me a smaller spectrum, especially when they're younger, of things that they can taste like. So I've been really digging into trying to understand the structure of red wines. I've been going to the store, even buying like cheap $6 to $10 bottles, and just seeing like, does the variety still stand out in these, styles of wine? How do they really express themselves against all price points? So that's going to be an adventure I'm on.
Yeah, it's definitely also way easier to identify some of those qualities, like what was done in the winery on a white wine, than your red wines, right?
Yeah.
Aging, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Calling out oak on a white wine, much easier than calling out the type of oak or like the usage of oak in a red wine. So, yeah, very, very cool. Looking forward to sharing new knowledge with you this year and stuff that we're drinking. Maybe there'll be a little bit more overlap in our collections if you're laying off the orange wines a bit in 2025. We'll see.
Yeah, well, I'm not buying to collect. I'm buying to taste as much as humanly possible. So we'll see. But
I don't know why I clown you for that, actually, though, because if I do pick something up from the store, it's going to be a like natural wine of some kind, probably. So I definitely never tell you about when I do that. I only tell you when I buy things to collect. But yeah, we should start talking about that more.
Well, we can. Everybody stay tuned. We have a bunch of good guests, really exciting guests, not just good, lined up for the coming months. If anybody has anybody they would like to hear from, whether it be a wine critic, wine producer, even their local sommelier or wine shop owner, we want to talk to everybody. The whole point of the show is to give you guys a perspective from all aspects and all angles of the wine world. So send us your recommendations and we'll do our best to have really exciting guests throughout the year. All right. And that is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.